chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, verses 1 through 5. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples, and embraced them, and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts, and given them much exhortation, he came into Greece, and there he abode 3 months. And when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he proposed to return through Macedonia. And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia Tychicus, and Trophimus. These, going before, tarried for us at Troas. Burkitt notes, the foregoing chapter acquaints us with a very great and eminent danger which the apostle escaped at Ephesus, where he had like to have been torn in pieces by those heathenish idolaters, which gave him occasion to say, 1 Corinthians 15:32, that after the manner of men he had fought with beasts at Ephesus. In this chapter we find that the apostle, yielding to the fury of his persecutors, prudently withdraws from Ephesus into Macedonia, yet not so much for his own safety, for he was willing to die Christ's sacrifice if he might live no longer Christ's servant, as for the church's future advantage, that the disciples in Ephesus might be no further persecuted upon his account. Hence learn that the ministers of the gospel may depart from a place and people where their ministry has been very successful when driven from thence by the fury of persecution. St. Paul here obeyed the command of Christ elsewhere, when they persecute you in one city, flee to another. Matthew 10:23. Observe, too, though St. Paul withdrew from Ephesus to allay the fury of persecution there, he left Timothy behind to confirm and comfort the disciples as his substitute, and to strengthen them in the faith of the gospel. 1 Timothy 1:3, I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, etc. Observe 3. The apostle no sooner escapes the fury of the heathens at Ephesus, but he is in danger of his life at Macedonia by his own countrymen, the Jews. Verse 3. The Jews laid wait for him. Well might the apostle say he was in death often, in peril of robbers, in perils in the city, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils among false brethren. 2 Corinthians 11:26. The wicked Jews, when they could not prevail against St. Paul by open force, contrive his ruin by secret treachery. But God gave him knowledge of their designs, and he avoided them by turning another way. Thence learn that it is high presumption and a bold tempting of God to run headlong upon evident and imminent dangers, and not to improve all lawful means we can to prevent and decline them. To trust to means is to neglect God, but to neglect the means of our own preservation is to tempt God. St. Paul would not tempt God by running into dangers though his cause was never so good. Observe 4. The persons are mentioned by name who accompanied the apostle and administered unto him, to wit, Sopater, Aristarchus, and Secundus, Gaius, and Timotheus, Tychicus, and Trophimus. These accompanied the apostle, not out of state, but for necessary service, to which may be added St. Luke, but being the penman of this book, he declines mentioning of himself by name, though his praise will forever be in the gospel and ecclesiastical story. Verses 6 through 12. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Toros in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they gathered together. And there sat in a window a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he sunk down with sleep, and fell down from the 3rd loft, and was taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And they brought the young man alive, and were not a little comforted. Burkitt notes, the next journey of St. Paul is from Macedonia in Greece to Troas in Asia, where he abode 7 days. During his stay here, several things are to be remarked and observed. Observe here, 1, how this great apostle became all things to all men, though he would not become a sin to any man. To the Jews he became as a Jew, for he stayed his journey all the 7 days of the Jewish Passover solemnity, and would not set forth to travel that time, because he would not offend the weak Jews. Accordingly he sailed not from Philippi till after the days of unleavened bread. Thus did St. Paul comply with the Jewish rites, which, though dead by the death of Christ, were yet not buried, and therefore his compliance was not sinful, but managed with a design to gain the Jews. Observe 3, that the change of the Sabbath from the 7th to the first day of the week was of apostolical observation now, as it was before of Christ's institution. On this day the Lord arose. On this day the disciples met, and Christ honored them with his presence. John 20. On this day the collection of poor saints was made. 1 Corinthians 16:2. Now this necessarily infers the abrogation of the Saturday Sabbath. For 6 days they were commanded to labor, and if they rested the 7th day and the first 2, they violated the law of God, which we cannot suppose they did. And consequently the apostles and primitive Christians observed the first day of the week in remembrance of the work of redemption, as the Jews of old observed the 7th in remembrance of the work of creation. Observe 3, the fervent zeal and unwearied diligence of the great apostle for the souls of men, and also for the patience and complacency with which his auditors attended upon his sermon at the time. Paul preached till midnight, verse 7. A very long sermon upon a particular occasion is neither unscriptural or unapostolical. We do not find that either the apostle was weary or the auditory drowsy at the dead time of night. Their wakefulness at midnight under a sermon condemns our sleepiness at midday. Observe 4, the pious and prudential care which the apostle and his hearers took that their night meeting should not fall under any calumny, or themselves reproached for doing anything indecently in the dead of night. To prevent this, the 8th verse informs us that there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together, exposing themselves and what they did to the view of all. Religious meetings in the night season are not only lawful in times of persecution, but necessary. Yet a special care ought to be taken to avoid all occasion of calumny, that the least suspicion may not arise concerning the honesty and holiness of those that do assemble at such unseasonable times. Observe 5, what a warning the Holy Ghost here leaves upon record for such asleep under the preaching of the Word. Eutychus, when asleep under St. Paul's long sermon, falls down from the 3rd loft and is taken up dead. Here note the time when he was overtaken with sleep, not at noonday, but at midnight. And it was not a sermon of an hour long that he was asleep under, but after St. Paul had preached several hours. This is not the case of our common sermon sleeper, who at noonday sleep under the Word, nay, settle and compose themselves to sleep, and do what they can to invite sleep to them. What if, with Eutychus, any of them fall down dead? Here is no Paul to rise them up. Or what if this wretched contemptor of the Word provoke God to say, "Sleep on, and be so stupefied that no ordinance shall awake you. Sleep on till hell's flames awake you." Observe 6. Eutychus is raised to life by a miraculous power communicated to St. Paul, which was a matter of great consolation to the spirits and great confirmation to the faith of the disciples. Verse 12. They brought the young man alive and were not a little comforted, not only for the young man's sake, but especially for their own sakes. For hereby God gave a convincing testimony to the word of his grace. God did hereby bear witness to it, and many were thereby confirmed in the belief of it. Verses 13 through 16. And we went before to ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot. And when he met with us at Assos, we took him in, and came to Mytilene. And we sailed hence, and came the next day over against Chios. And the next day we arrived at Samos, and tarried at Trogyllium. And the next day we went to Miletus. For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus, because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Burkitt notes, here an account is given of several travels of the apostle, namely, from Taros to Assos, and thence to Mytilene, next day to Samos, then to Trogyllium, and the next day following to Miletus, passing by and not touching at Ephesus. For the apostle, having an earnest desire to be at Jerusalem at the feast of Pentecost, so that he might, in that concourse, have a larger opportunity of spreading the gospel, he would not now call at Ephesus, lest he should be detained too long by the brethren there. From the whole note 1, the indefatigable diligence of this great apostle, and his unwearied industry in the service of the gospel, how he travels from place to place, and here from Tauros to Assos, on foot all alone by land. He did not affect to ride with a pompous train and retinue. He goes off on foot, expecting to meet with more opportunity of sowing the seed of the gospel as he passed through towns and villages by land among those he conversed with. So intent was the holy man upon the work of winning souls. Whereas, had he traveled by sea, this opportunity had been lost. A happy example for all the ministers of Christ to prefer an opportunity of doing good to the souls of others before their own ease or profit. Note 2. The true reason why St. Paul was so very desirous to be at Jerusalem at the feast of the Pentecost. Not that he placed any religion in observing this abrogated feast, but because that the vast concourse of people at such times would give him a fairer opportunity to glorify Christ and to propagate the gospel. This made him so desirous to get to Jerusalem by the feast of the Pentecost. Learn thence that the ministers of Christ, without the imputation of vainglory or seeking popular applause, may warrantably desire, and occasionally lay hold upon, an opportunity of dispensing a word to a numerous auditory, in hopes that, casting the net of the gospel among many, they may enclose some.